Have you ever held a child in your arms and wondered if love alone could save them? Now imagine this. It's a bitter autumn night on the edge of Lone Cedar Ridge. You're a widow, alone, grieving the child you lost not so long ago. Then there's a knock at the door. A tall Apache warrior stands before you, bleeding, desperate, and holding a dying baby. He doesn't ask for shelter. He asks for milk. The wind howls, and behind him, your neighbors are gathering faces you've known your whole life, now twisted in suspicion and fear. You can feel their eyes on you, hear their whispers like knives. What would you do? Would you turn away a man they call your enemy? Or would you open your arms to the child he's begging you to save? This is the story of a woman who chose not comfort, not safety, but compassion, and how that single choice changed more than one life. If you've ever lost someone, if you've ever dared to love again through the pain, stay with us. This story was meant for you. The wind had turned sharp that evening. Autumn had arrived in Lone Cedar Ridge, not with a soft hush, but with a rustle of dry leaves and a hiss through the chinks in old wooden walls. Inside a small log cabin perched near the ridge's edge, Rachel Callahan knelt beside the hearth, coaxing flame from juniper twigs with hands scraped raw from splitting wood that morning. The cabin was quiet, save for the creak of timber and the occasional sputter from the kindling. Rachel, wrapped in her late husband's flannel coat, moved like a woman accustomed to silence, each motion deliberate, steady, as though she were trying not to wake the ghosts that lived inside her walls. She had just added a handful of bark when it came the knock, not timid, not neighborly. It was fast, desperate, the kind of knock that carried hunger, fear, the kind that stirred old memories Rachel had buried under layers of ash and grief. She froze. Her fingers tightened around the poker. Another knock followed harder, urgent. Rachel's heart quickened as she reached for the rifle resting beside the door. Then came a voice, cracked and dry, muffled by the wind but clear in its plea. "Please, milk. My son, he's dying." Rachel's breath hitched. Her fingers hovered near the rifle's trigger, but something in the voice, something broken, stopped her. She set the rifle aside. With hands that trembled only slightly, she slid the iron bar from the door and pulled it open. There, on the porch, stood a tall man, his skin sun-worn, shoulders broad, hair tied back in leather cords. He wore a faded blanket, draped over one side, exposing a shoulder smeared with dried blood and dust. In his arms, wrapped in a thin, ragged cloth, lay a baby barely breathing, lips cracked, face pale with thirst. The child made no sound. Only the rise and fall of his shallow chest proved he was alive. Rachel's gaze locked onto the child's sunken cheeks, the ribs showing beneath the blanket like fence slats. Behind the man, several townsfolk had begun to gather across the dirt trail, lanterns swaying in their hands, voices carrying fear more than facts. "It's an Apache," someone hissed. "Don't let him in." Another warned. Rachel didn't move, not at the voices, not at the fear. She stepped forward, ignoring the gasps behind her. "Give him to me," she said, her voice steady, though her throat burned with emotion. The man hesitated, his eyes dark, unreadable searching hers. "I have no milk," he said softly. "He will die. So will he if you stand there much longer." Rachel answered. There was no righteousness in her tone, no bravado, just truth. He nodded once barely, and then, carefully, reverently, placed the baby into her arms. The weight of the child was feather-light, too light. Rachel held him close, felt the brittle bones under her hands. the cold that shouldn't belong to a baby. She turned, carried him inside without another word, and sat down beside the fire. The Apache man remained at the door, kneeling silently, watching. Rachel opened her coat, unbuttoned the top of her dress, pulled her blouse aside, guided the child's mouth to her breast. At first, there was nothing. A pause where time seemed to fold in on itself. Then, a weak latch, a faint pull. Rachel exhaled. Tears sprang uninvited to her eyes as warmth bloomed between them. She rocked slowly, instinctively, as the baby began to nurse, the rhythm hesitant but steadying. Behind her, the shutter banged once in the wind. The fire popped softly. Outside, the murmurs faded as one by one, the lanterns turned away. Inside, silence fell. Rachel did not look up at the man. Not yet. She simply held the baby tighter, one hand on his back, the other cradling his tiny head. A whisper broke the quiet. "You saved him." She didn't reply. Words felt unnecessary. She could feel the baby breathing now, feel life returning to that tiny frame. "What's his name?" she asked. Eyes on the flames. "Elan," he answered. "Elan Redhawk." "No," Rachel said gently, looking down at the boy. The baby. A pause. Then, barely audible, he said, "He was born Taklisha, but we haven't spoken his name since his mother died." Rachel's heart clenched. He deserves to be known. She looked back at Elan. His eyes reflected firelight and fatigue, and something else, something old and burdened and brave. She nodded toward the rocking cradle in the corner, empty until now. "He can stay here tonight." He said nothing, but he didn't leave either. Morning came to Lone Cedar Ridge, not with the sound of birdsong, but with a cold stillness that settled heavy across the hills. A faint mist clung to the earth as Rachel Callahan stepped onto her porch. The baby wrapped in a wool blanket pressed to her chest. He was warmer now. The blue tinge had faded from his lips, and his small fists curled with the instinct of life. She sat in the rocker her husband had built long ago, the wood creaking softly beneath her, and watched as the early light broke across the ridge, inside. Elan Redhawk stood quietly by the hearth, eyes scanning the room without moving much at all. Aowari. His figure was tall, but there was no threat in it, only weariness, the kind that seeps into bone. His wounded shoulder had started to bleed again during the night, a dark stain blooming through the cloth he'd tied there. Rachel noticed, but he didn't speak of it. He hadn't spoken since handing the child to her the night before. She rocked gently, feeling the child's breath even out against her skin. Then, after a long silence, she asked softly, "How long since he last fed?" Elan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared into the embers of the hearth, as if searching for time itself. "3 days," he said at last, his voice rough from disuse and dust. Since his mother passed, Rachel didn't look up. And she... fever. He replied, "Came fast. No one could help. Not out there." The words landed between them like falling ash. Rachel nodded slowly. She understood too well how fast sickness could come and how helpless it made you feel. "My boy," she said, not meeting his eyes, was 6 weeks when the fever took him. That stopped Elan. He turned slightly, his expression unreadable. "Elijah," she added, had just started making these little sounds cooing, like doves. And then one night he went quiet. Just quiet. Elan said nothing, but his gaze, fixed now on the baby in her arms, grew softer. Rachel looked down. I tried willow bark tea, cold cloths, held him against my skin until the heat burned me. Nothing mattered. Nothing could reach him. Silence returned. This time, gentler, like a shared language neither of them had words for. A moment passed. Then another. The baby stirred in her arms, sighed through his nose, and nestled closer to her breast. I buried him up on the ridge, Rachel said, her voice barely more than a breath. Next to his father, Elan's brow furrowed, just slightly. He took a step closer but stayed behind the chair, his hands open, loose at his sides. You buried your husband too. Rachel nodded. He left 3 months after Elijah passed. Couldn't stand the silence of the house. Said it smelled like a grave. Elan's lips pressed into a line. He didn't offer comfort, didn't say he was sorry. But something shifted in the air, an acknowledgement between the broken. He reached slowly into the pouch at his waist, the movement careful, deliberate, like someone approaching a skittish horse. He drew out a bundle, wrapped in aged deerskin, and held it out. Rachel looked at it, but didn't move. For you, he said simply. She hesitated, then took the bundle and unwrapped it. Inside was a small square of linen, coarse but clean, its edges fraying. At the center, embroidered in golden thread, was a sun, its rays long and uneven, each stitch imperfect but done with care. My wife made it, Elan said, his voice distant, for our son's naming day. Rachel's breath caught. He never received it. Elan added, soldiers came before the moon turned. She died trying to protect him. Both gone. Rachel held the cloth in both hands, like it might dissolve if she gripped too hard. She said the sun heals what words cannot, Elan whispered. Rachel stared at the symbol, simple, childlike, radiant. Her eyes welled, but she did not cry. She'd shed so many tears in the past year she feared she had none left. I'll keep it safe, she said quietly. I promise. He nodded once, then turned away, retreating to the far wall, where he sank to the floor, his back to the logs, his knees bent and arms resting on them. Rachel rose, walked to the cradle she'd carved out of an old drawer, and laid the baby gently into it. She placed the cloth beside him, the sun catching a flicker of morning light through the shutters. For the first time in months, her home did not feel hollow, it did not echo. She turned to Elan. Do you have a name for him now? He looked at her, then at the child, and after a long moment said, Jonah. Rachel smiled faintly. Jonah Redhawk, she whispered. It sounded real. It sounded right that night, as dusk settled again over Lone Cedar Ridge. Rachel stood beside the cradle, a carving knife in hand. Above the baby's sleeping form, she etched one word into the beam above the cradle. Jonah. The name was uneven, the lines shallow, but it was there permanent, behind her. Elan slept near the fire, wrapped in the blanket he'd arrived with, his hand resting near the pouch that no longer held his wife's cloth. Rachel sat down beside him and whispered into the quiet, You're not alone here. Not anymore. Outside, the wind curled around the cabin like a blessing. Inside, a new name had been carved into the wood, and in the warmth of that firelight, 2 people who had each dug a grave now found something to live for. The second night came colder than the first. The fire burned steady in the hearth, but a dry chill crept under the door and through the walls, making the cabin feel smaller, tighter. Rachel Callahan moved quietly through the dim space, her bare feet soundless on the creaking floorboards. In the cradle, baby Jonah stirred, but didn't wake. His breathing was still shallow, but stronger now. There was color in his cheeks. His fingers, once limp, now curled and flexed, as if grasping for the warmth that had finally found him. Elan Redhawk sat near the fire, his back straight, the blanket around his shoulders drawn close. He hadn't asked to stay inside, but Rachel had insisted. His shoulder had begun to swell around the wound, and his jaw was clenched harder with every passing hour. She'd seen enough fever take hold in strong men to know when pride had to yield to practicality. That evening, she had boiled a pot of chamomile and sage, poured it into a dented tin mug, and set it beside him without a word. He had accepted it with a nod and nothing more. Now, she knelt beside the cradle, adjusting Jonah's blanket and smoothing his fine, dark hair. Her fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary. She remembered doing this with Elijah, how the simple act of brushing his hair back had made her feel useful, needed, even when the fever had already begun to win. She whispered now, more to herself than to the child, "You're still here. That's something." Behind her, Elan shifted slightly. "He hasn't cried since last night," he said. Rachel looked over her shoulder. "Not from hunger, at least," she replied. "Just from memory." Elan's brow furrowed. "You think babies remember?" She nodded slowly. "They remember the feeling of arms, of warmth, of hunger too. I think." She turned back to Jonah, lifting him gently from the cradle. She sat down in the old rocker, positioning the child in her arms. He stirred, mouth moving weakly against her chest, as if guided by instinct. Rachel hesitated. Even now, there was still a flicker of doubt, a ghost of guilt, that whispered this wasn't her child, that she had no right. But then the baby latched, and the hush in the room deepened, thickened with something more than silence. She held her breath, eyes shining with quiet disbelief. The rhythm of nursing was gentle but insistent, life pulling itself back from the edge, one heartbeat at a time. Elan watched, unmoving. There was awe in his gaze, but also something older, something like grief and reverence and fear, all braided together. He didn't speak, but Rachel could feel his presence across the space, as clearly as if he'd placed his hand on her shoulder. The rocker creaked as she moved, slow and steady, her voice low. "He takes more each time." Elan nodded. "He's strong, like his father." A pause. "No," Elan said. "Stronger. I wouldn't have survived this. Not as a child." Rachel studied him for a moment. "You survived plenty. I had a mother until I was 10. He answered, eyes fixed on the fire, and a tribe. I was not alone. Rachel lowered her gaze. "Neither is he now." They didn't speak after that for a long while. The baby suckled, the fire cracked, and outside, wind wrapped around the cabin like a story looking for a voice. Later that night, after Jonah had fallen asleep in the crook of her arm, Rachel carried him to the cradle and tucked him in beside the embroidered cloth with the golden sun. She watched him for a few minutes longer, then turned to Elan. "I want to ask something," she said. He looked up, cautious. "Why me? Why this door?" Elan stared at the floor before answering. "The ridge looks down on the valley. I saw your chimney first. Smoke means fire. Fire means life. That's all no." He met her eyes. "I saw how you stood at the church last spring, when your husband's grave was fresh. Everyone else kept walking. But you stood still, not crying, not asking for anything, just standing." Rachel blinked. "You saw that I remember what grief looks like. I thought maybe yours would recognize mine." She nodded, slowly, her throat tightening. Elan shifted his weight. "I didn't plan on staying, only wanted him to live." Rachel walked over, pulled the small quilt from the back of the chair, and laid it over him. "Then let him keep living. Stay." He didn't answer, but he didn't push the quilt away either. The following morning, Rachel found herself waking before dawn, as she used to when Elijah was small. She moved on instinct now, checking Jonah's breathing, warming water for tea, peeling dried apples for a morning mash. The rhythm came back to her like a muscle memory she hadn't realized she still held. At sunrise, Elaine stirred. Rachel handed him a cup of hot water laced with honey and ginger. He accepted it silently. "Do you want to name him?" Something else she asked, nodding toward the cradle. Elan tilted his head. Taklisha was his birth name. It means falling leaves. Rachel considered that. It's beautiful. But I've been calling him Jonah. Elan didn't flinch. She added, I had to call him something when I held him. Jonah means dove, a symbol of hope. His eyes softened, just a little. You can call him what you like. No, she said, firm but gentle. Only if you allow it. He looked at the child, then back at Rachel. He is breathing. You gave him that. The name is yours to choose. Rachel smiled, faint and steady. Then he'll be Jonah Redhawk. Something passed between them in that moment. Not a promise, not yet, but a thread, a root, a beginning. The days that followed moved slowly, marked not by clocks or calendars, but by the sound of tiny breaths and the soft knock at the door just after sunrise. Each morning, Rachel Callahan would rise with the light, her body remembering old rhythms she thought had long faded, heating water, folding quilts, preparing warm milk mixed with mashed beans or boiled cornmeal. And every morning, without fail, Elan Redhawk would appear at her threshold, carrying Jonah in his arms, wrapped in the same wool blanket, worn thin by use and love. He never stepped inside without invitation, and even then, never farther than the hearth. Rachel noticed that he always removed his boots before entering, a gesture that spoke not of submission, but of quiet respect. He watched, always, with eyes like storm-worn stone, dark and unwavering, as she held Jonah, fed him, rocked him in the old creaking chair that had once belonged to her mother. There was something sacred in the routine, something unspoken, yet deeply understood between them, that this was no longer just about survival, but something more fragile, more human, connection, trust. Rachel began to speak, more as the days passed, not always to Elan directly, but aloud, as if letting her words stretch across the space between them might soften its edges. I carved that cradle from a dresser drawer, she said one afternoon, adjusting Jonah's blanket. It was Elijah's. Elan said nothing, but his gaze lingered on the small wooden frame, fingers tightening around the edge of the wool blanket. I lined it with lamb's wool, she added, brushing dust from the rim. Thought it'd be softer on his skin. She didn't mention that Elijah had only used it for 3 nights before the fever took him. Some things were too sharp to speak aloud. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in streaks of copper and lilac, Rachel served a pot of beans stewed with dried chili and thin slices of smoked venison. She handed Delan a wrapped portion in cloth as he prepared to leave. For the road, she said simply. He hesitated. You don't owe me more. I don't give out of debt, she replied. I give because he's hungry. And so are you. Their fingers brushed as she passed him the bundle. It was a brief contact, but it startled something in both of them. Elaine nodded once, then turned toward the door. He paused before stepping out, his eyes falling on the cradle where Jonah now slept, lips slightly parted in soft dreams. The next morning, Rachel returned from the well to find a small object resting on the windowsill. It was no bigger than her hand, a carved horse. its legs bent mid-gallop, mane frozen in imagined wind. Every curve was precise, the wood smoothed to a dark sheen. Across its back was a tiny strip of leather, and on the underside, carved in steady hand, were the words, "So he will remember his courage always." Rachel stared at it for a long moment, then pressed it gently to her chest. That night, when Elan arrived to collect Jonah, she met him at the door with the horse in her hand. "You made this?" He nodded. "It's beautiful. It's Apache," he said. "The horse is freedom, strength. Our people ride with the sky. My son must know that, even if he grows among yours." She held his gaze for a breath longer than usual. Then she stepped aside. "You can come in." He hesitated only a moment, then crossed the threshold. It was the first time he'd done so without being asked. Inside, the fire cast golden shadows across the room, dancing over the stone hearth and rough-hewn beams. Elan sat on the floor, back resting against the wall. Rachel held Jonah in her arms, rocking slowly, for a long time. They didn't speak. Eventually, she glanced at him and said, barely above a whisper, "You are not what they say." Elan's expression didn't change. "I am what the land made me," he answered. "But I have never hurt your people. Not once." "I believe you," she replied. Outside, coyotes cried into the night. Inside, the flames flickered in more than just the hearth. Later, Rachel stirred the coals with the poker, watching them pulse red and dim again. Ellen sat quietly nearby, knees bent, hands resting loosely. Jonah slept soundly in the cradle between them, one small fist curled around the carved horse. Then, Rachel broke the silence. Her voice was slow, like water over stone. Elijah had red hair, just a wisp of it, like fire in the leaves come fall. Elan didn't interrupt. He was 6 weeks when the fever came. She said, "I did everything I knew, cool cloths, willow bark, tea. I held him against my skin, thinking maybe if I loved him hard enough, it would drive the sickness out." She looked into the fire. It didn't. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things unsaid, of shared ache and hard memories. Then, slowly, Ellen reached into the pouch at his waist and drew out another small object wrapped in deerskin. He handed it to her without a word. Rachel unfolded it carefully. Inside was a square of worn linen, embroidered with a sun in golden thread. "My wife made this for our son's naming day," he said, voice low. "He never got to wear it. Soldiers came before the moon turned warm again." Rachel touched the stitching, felt each loop and knot beneath her fingertips, like the remnants of a prayer. "In our tribe," Elaine continued, "the sun heals what words cannot." Rachel swallowed hard. "And now you carry the sun," she said. Elaine's jaw tensed. "Sometimes I think I carry only shadow." She reached across the cradle, her fingers brushing his. "You brought him to me," she said. "That was light." He looked at her hand, then at Jonah, then back to the place where their skin met. "I feared you would turn us away," he murmured. "I feared I had no more to give." The fire cracked, spitting sparks. They sat like that, two people bent by loss, but not broken. Not anymore. By the 4th day, the wind changed. Rachel Callahan could feel it in the way people passed along the dirt road outside her cabin, not with neighborly nods, but with lingering glances that stayed just a breath too long. Whispers drifted behind her back like dust, gritty and clinging. They came not with questions, but with certainty, as if her kindness had betrayed something sacred. "She's nursing a redskin's baby," Someone muttered loud enough for her to hear, "She's lost her mind." Another scoffed. Rachel didn't flinch. She had lived through worse than rumor, but that didn't mean it didn't sting. Each morning, when Elan Redhawk arrived with Jonah, the air seemed heavier. Jonah no longer whimpered from thirst. He reached for her now. Small arms outstretched the moment he saw her face. She took him without hesitation, wrapped him in the warmth of her shawl, and rocked him by the hearth. The name Jonah had settled between them like an old, trusted quilt. Neither questioned it anymore. He was hers, and she was his. On the 5th day, Rachel cooked cornbread with wild honey she had bartered from a passing trader. She mashed beans with a pinch of salt, and when Elan came to the door that evening, she offered it all without a word. He accepted, always with that same quiet nod, but the look in his eyes had changed something alert, watchful, as if he too had felt the shift in the wind. That night, Rachel stood by the window long after Jonah had fallen asleep, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. The moon hung high and clear. Outside, the land lay still. Then came the sound hoofbeats, slow at first, then more. She turned toward the door just as fists struck it hard, angry and unrelenting. Rachel Callahan, a voice bellowed from outside, "Come out here." Now she laid Jonah in the cradle, wrapped him gently, and moved to the porch. 6 men stood in her yard, their outlines jagged in the moonlight. At the front was Amos Riggins, owner of the general store, a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes and a mouth twisted in righteous fury. Behind him stood Henry Clay, Caleb Price, and 3 others she barely recognized, rifles slung across their backs. "You are betraying your kind," Amos growled, fists clenched, sheltering that Apache, feeding his child. "Do you even remember what they did here?" Rachel's eyes didn't waver. "I remember loss," she said calmly. "I do not need reminding." "He's not one of us," Caleb snapped. "That baby's not one of us. He's a child," Rachel replied. "And he is hungry." She stepped down from the porch, barefoot in the dust, the earth still warm beneath her. Jonah stirred in her arms, his tiny hand searching, without pause. She adjusted her shawl, shifted him gently, and brought him to her breast. Gasps rippled through the group like a sudden gust of wind. Rachel lifted her chin. "This child is not your enemy," she said evenly, "but you're starting to sound like mine. For a heartbeat." No one moved. Then footsteps. From the edge of the road came the sound of a cane tapping dirt, slow and steady. Miriam Quinn emerged from the shadows, widow of the town's first preacher. Her gray hair was twisted back in a braid, and in her hands she carried a heavy pot covered with cloth. She walked past the men, silent despite their mutters, and set the pot gently on Rachel's porch. "Chicken stew," she said, "with barley. For the baby. For the mother." She turned to Rachel, then to Jonah. "Feed him. That's what mothers do." Then she turned and walked away, head held high. The silence that followed was thicker than heat. Amos spat into the dirt. "This isn't over," he muttered, then turned and stormed off. The others followed, boots stirring up dust, rifles bumping against their backs. Rachel stood alone again, Jonah still nursing, his small fingers curling into her shawl. She looked down at him, then at the pot Miriam had left behind. It was still warm. That night, when Elan arrived, she didn't say a word. She served him a bowl of the stew, sat beside him by the fire, and watched him eat. He said nothing, but his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the spoon. When the bowl was empty, he set it aside and looked at her. They came, he said. She nodded. They left. His gaze drifted toward the cradle, where Jonah slept, soft and safe. And the woman, he asked. Rachel smiled, wearied but proud. A stew and a few kind words. Elan nodded, a deep understanding in his eyes. Kindness, he said, is stronger than fear, but it must be chosen. She reached for his hand, placed hers atop it, fingers warm and steady. Outside, the stars had begun to spread across the sky like scattered salt. Inside, the fire whispered against the logs, and somewhere beyond the reach of judgment, a man, a woman, and a child sat wrapped in something far more powerful than approval, truth. The cabin had never felt this quiet before. After the stew was gone and the fire had died down to glowing embers, Rachel Callahan sat alone at the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap, the shawl still faintly smelling of barley and smoke. Jonah was asleep in the cradle just a few feet away, his breath steady, one hand resting over the carved wooden horse Elan had given him. But Rachel's thoughts moved, with the wind scattered, unsettled. The confrontation from that afternoon echoed in her chest like a slow, steady drum. She had stood her ground. She had defied the men of her town. She had nursed Jonah in full view of their scorn. And yet, something inside her twisted, quiet but relentless. She rose and walked to the window. The moon was half-shadowed now, casting strange shapes across the land. She watched the silhouettes of trees sway, felt the creak of the cabin's old bones beneath her feet. She didn't notice the tears until they had reached her chin. Behind her, a soft voice broke the silence. "You are afraid?" She turned slightly. Elan Redhawk stood near the fire, his body half lit by the fading orange glow. His wound was bandaged now, cleaner than before, but his eyes were heavy, not just from pain, but from knowing. Rachel didn't deny it. "I'm afraid they'll come back," she said. "Afraid they'll try again. That next time, it won't be just words and stares." "They will," he said calmly, "because that is what fear does. When it has no place to go, it turns to fire." She stepped toward him. "And what do we do when that fire spreads?" Elan met her eyes. "We hold the water." His answer was simple, but it struck something deep. She looked away. "They see me as a traitor now, feeding your child, letting you in. They never saw you at all," he said. Rachel pressed her hands to her face, then dropped them with a frustrated sigh. "I don't know what I'm doing. Elan, I don't know what this is." He didn't move. "It is life, nothing more, nothing less." She sank onto the chair beside the hearth. "I've already lost one child. I buried my husband. And now, I'm standing between an angry town and a man they call their enemy. And for what? For a child who isn't mine, for a man I barely know." Silence settled again. Then Elan spoke, his voice slow and careful. "When my wife died, I thought the earth had ended. Not just my world. The world, I thought nothing beautiful would grow again. But then Jonah cried. And I still had hands, still had fire, still had breath." He walked to the cradle, looked down at the child. "I don't know what this is, either," he admitted. "But I know what it isn't. It isn't hate. It isn't violence. It isn't silence." Rachel followed his gaze. "He sleeps easier here," she murmured. "Because he knows he is wanted," Elan said. That night, Rachel lay awake long after Elan had gone. The stew pot sat empty beside the hearth. The cradle glowed softly in the moonlight. She turned over, thoughts the way farmers turn soil slowly, thoroughly, looking for stones that would stop growth. What if the townspeople did more than threaten next time? What if they came with torches? What if someone got hurt? Elan, Jonah, herself. She closed her eyes, her breath catching. And yet, what was the alternative? Turn them away. Tell Elan not to return. Pretend she hadn't held Jonah close to her heart, as if he'd come from her own body. The thought made her sick. In the darkness, Rachel whispered, I won't go back to being half alive. She rose at dawn and found Elan already waiting on the porch, his arms full of fresh cedar logs. He looked at her, not with surprise, but with quiet understanding. Thought I'd bring wood, he said. She nodded. We'll need it. He stepped inside without her needing to say the words. Later that morning, while Jonah napped, Rachel took a clean towel and walked to the creek behind the ridge. She dipped it into the cold water, watching as ripples spread outward in delicate rings. She knelt beside the bank, her eyes on the reflection of trees swaying overhead. And then she said, softly, as if to the wind itself, if I must choose between peace and love, I will choose love, even if it costs me everything. When she returned, Elan was outside, carving something again. The horse had been only the beginning. Now, she saw the start of a cradle rail. The wood curved like waves, Apache symbols etched carefully into the side symbols she didn't yet understand, but felt were meant to protect. That evening, she told him, I will not send you away. I will not give him up. Elan didn't reply immediately. He looked down at his hands. Then, at the house, the porch, the cedar trees lining the field. I have a place up north, he said, deep into the pines. I could take him, raise him with my people. It would be safer. Rachel stepped closer. And would he still reach for me when he cried? Elan's shoulders tightened. I'm not asking what's safer, she said. I'm asking what's right. He looked at her fully then, and something deep passed between them. Not passion, not yet, but something older, something earned. Then we stay, he said. They both knew what that meant. They both knew what could come. But for the first time, fear wasn't what led them. It was the sound of a child's breath rising and falling in the quiet of a home neither of them had expected. And it was enough. The sun had just slipped behind the western ridge when the warning came. Miriam Quinn stood in Rachel Callahan's doorway, her face pale in the fading light, her voice low but firm. They're coming tonight, she said. Amos Riggins, and not just him. He's riled up more than half the town, armed, angry. You won't want to be here when the moon rises. Rachel didn't ask how she knew. The truth in Miriam's eyes was enough. Without a word, she turned toward the cradle where Jonah slept, his breath even, one fist still curled around the horse Elan had carved. Thank you, she said to Miriam, her voice tight with urgency. Miriam gave a curt nod and vanished down the path, cane tapping fast against the dry earth. Inside the cabin, Rachel moved with clarity, born not of panic, but of resolve. She packed a small knapsack blankets, a tin of jerky, a hunk of cornbread, the embroidered suncloth. She wrapped Jonah in a wool shawl and pressed her lips to his temple. Elan Redhawk appeared in the doorway, moments later, his figure sharp against the twilight, a sling already strung across his shoulder. His eyes met hers, and there were no questions. He simply stepped inside, adjusted the strap across his chest, and took the bundle she handed him. Then, without a word, they slipped out the back. The air was dry and still, the kind of stillness that came before a storm. The wind had died completely, as though the land itself were holding its breath. Together, they moved across the clearing toward the timberline, Rachel clutching her rifle, Elan walking just ahead, his long strides nearly silent across the brittle grass. They entered the forest, the trees closing around them like cathedral pillars. Jonah stirred once in the sling, then settled again, his body soft against Elan's chest. Rachel stayed close, stepping over twisted roots, ducking under low branches, the sounds of their passage swallowed by pine and shadow. At the creek, a ribbon of half-frozen silver. Elan paused, raised a hand, and signaled for silence. Rachel stilled beside him. Then she saw it. Moonlight flashed against metal, just beyond the far bank. Dozens of shapes, crouched and waiting, the glint of rifles, the outlines of men, a trap. Elan pressed her back, gently against the mossy base of a thick cedar. He crouched beside her, rifle drawn, eyes narrowed. "Stay," he whispered. "Protect him." Rachel held her breath, heart pounding like hooves on dry earth. Then a voice rang out from across the water. "Come on out." Apache Amos Riggins bellowed, his voice thick with heat. "And bring the white woman and her little redskin. We'll send you back to the dirt where you came from." Rachel clutched Jonah tighter, his warmth grounding her as fear threatened to rise. Elan's grip tightened on the rifle, but he didn't fire. He waited, watching. Then a sound behind them, another rustle, another light. From the shadows behind the creek, a torch flared, and with it a figure stepped into the open. Tall, steady. Reverend Luther. His long coat was dusted with leaves, his gray beard tangled from travel. Beside him, a man in a wide-brimmed hat held up a badge that gleamed in the firelight. "I am Special Agent Tully," the man said, his voice carrying over the creek. "Federal Marshal. These people are under federal protection." A stunned silence swept over the mob. "This is Ranger land," Amos growled, stepping forward. "You've got no right." "We have every right," Tully interrupted. "You come any closer, and you're not just threatening a woman and a child. You're threatening a citizen of the United States under federal guardianship." A murmur rippled through the gathered men. Some shifted uncomfortably. One lowered his rifle. Amos looked at Rachel, then Elan, then Jonah, his face twisted, caught between disbelief and fury. "You'll regret this," he spat. "All of you." Reverend Luther stepped forward again, cane planted firm in the soil. "This woman," he said, voice ringing, "has shown more courage than any man I've seen this season. And this man," he gestured to Elan, "has done nothing but protect his son. If there is shame here, it belongs to those who cannot see past blood and bone." No one answered. At last, Amos turned, snarled something under his breath, and stalked off into the trees. The others followed, one by one, boots scraping frost-covered roots, lanterns bobbing like dying stars. Only then did Rachel let her breath out. She slumped against the cedar trunk. Jonah still pressed to her chest, her arms shaking. Elan lowered his rifle. Reverend Luther crossed the creek with surprising speed for a man of his age. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice suddenly gentler. "We're fine," Rachel said. Tully nodded. "We'll escort you back. They won't try again soon, but this place may not stay quiet for long." Rachel looked at Elan. He didn't speak, but his eyes asked the same question hers did. Where could they go that would be safe? But Jonah stirred then, yawned, and nestled deeper into Elan's arms. And the answer came not in words, but in that small breath of peace, hard-earned and precious. The morning after the stand at the creek came quiet and pale, like the land itself was exhaling for the first time in weeks. Dew clung to the tall grass along the ridge, and the first light spilled into the cabin not as fire, but as forgiveness. Rachel Callahan woke slowly, the ache in her body not from fear or tension now, but from the weight of something loosening. A tension had broken open the night before, not just outside, but within. Elan Redhawk sat on the floor, by the hearth, his back against the wall, his injured leg stretched out, the dressing still faintly stained. Jonah slept curled beside him in the cradle. One hand flopped over his chest, his breath soft and steady. The fire had burned low in the night, but Rachel hadn't needed it. The warmth had come from something else, something wordless and real. That day, no one knocked, no men with rifles, no shouts from across the fields, no eyes burning from behind fences, just the rustle of cedar trees and the soft crackle of coals. Rachel stirred the embers with the poker, added new logs, and poured hot water over dried mint leaves for tea. She glanced at Elan, his eyes closed, his breathing even, and for a brief moment she let herself imagine that this cabin, this stillness, this shared silence was home, not borrowed, not temporary, just theirs. When he woke, she handed him the tea. He took it wordlessly and drank. They said nothing until late morning. "I'll need to return to the hills soon," Elan said, not looking at her. Rachel's chest tightened. "Why, I have family there, people who've wondered what became of me." Rachel set the kettle aside. "And you'll bring Jonah." He paused. "I would not take him without your blessing." She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "What are you asking me to do? Give you permission to walk away with the boy I've nursed, bathed, rocked to sleep for a week?" "No," he said quietly. "I am asking if you would come with us." Rachel didn't respond right away. She stood, walked to the cradle, and watched Jonah's chest rise and fall. His lashes fluttered, a dream dancing behind closed lids. "I left my entire life behind once already," she said. "When Elijah died, when my husband left, I buried them and stayed here because I didn't know who I was without them. And now?" Elan waited. "I don't know who I am without Jonah." He rose slowly, wincing as he shifted his weight. "Then stay with him." She turned, eyes narrowing. "And what about you?" Elan looked down. "I have never belonged anywhere for long." Rachel crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate. "Well," she said, stopping just before him, "maybe you should start." They stood like that for a moment, the space between them as fragile as breath. And then Rachel did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She reached for someone, not out of need, but choice. She placed her hand gently over his. "I want to build something again," she said. "Something that doesn't break." Elan's fingers curled slowly around hers. "So do I." That afternoon, while Jonah slept in the cradle, Rachel unrolled parchment from a drawer and began to write. Letters. One to Miriam Quinn, thanking her for the stew, for the courage. One to Reverend Luther, for standing in the water beside them. One to Amos Riggins, not of apology, but clarity. "You cannot shame me for loving a child who needed saving," she wrote. "And I will not apologize for building a home out of what the world tried to destroy." Elan worked quietly outside, smoothing the railings of a new cradle. Not because Jonah needed it, he had one already, but because building with his hands had always been his way of breathing through pain. He carved symbols along the sides, wind, protection, growth, and said nothing when Rachel leaned in the doorway to watch. As dusk fell, Rachel set a pot of beans to cook, sliced bread, and prepared tea with pine needles and a pinch of salt. They ate together, not as guests, not as strangers, but as something closer to kin. Later that night, when Jonah cried out in his sleep, Rachel lifted him from the cradle and held him against her chest. Elan approached, placed a hand lightly on the boy's back. "He's dreaming," Elan murmured. Rachel swayed gently, her voice low. "Let it be a good one." And in the hush of that room, as the wind brushed against the cabin walls, and the stars bloomed across the night sky, a quiet root sank deeper into the soil beneath them, not loud or dramatic, but steady. Something had begun to grow. A year passed over Lone Cedar Ridge like a slow breath. The winds grew soft, then sharp, then soft again. The cedars bloomed with pollen, shed it, and bloomed once more. And in that rhythm of seasons, unforgiving but faithful life returned. Not with thunder or trumpet, but with quiet persistence. Rachel Callahan no longer measured time by fear or silence, but by the sound of Jonah's feet on the porch each morning, the shrill laugh he gave when a bird startled from the fence post, the way his arms reached for her, with the unspoken trust of a child who knew where he belonged. The cabin had changed. It had grown not just in size. With new beams, Elan Redhawk had hewn himself from the pines to frame a second room, but in tone. The air inside was warmer now, not just from the fire, but from the presence of two voices where once there had been none. Rachel had painted the walls in soft earth colors, covered the floor in woven rugs she'd bartered for, and placed wildflowers in glass jars along the sill. But the greatest change stood just behind the cabin, where the old smokehouse had been cleared and rebuilt into a modest one-room school. Rachel had drawn the first lines herself, measured with string and chalk, and Elan had laid the foundation stone by stone. He built the benches with his own hands, carved the alphabet in English and Apache on the wall. Children came. Some were settler children, curious and cautious, coaxed by mothers who had begun to speak Rachel's name again without whispering. Some were Apache children, quiet at first, brought by uncles and aunts who watched from the trees. They sat together, those children, under a low tin roof with the wind weaving in through the cracks, and learned not just letters, but how to speak to each other with kindness. Rachel taught the alphabet by drawing it in the dirt. She taught numbers with dried beans. She told stories sometimes of animals, sometimes of stars, sometimes of a boy named Jonah who once came wrapped in wool, half-starved and silent, but now laughed louder than the wind. When the sun dipped low, the children would scatter down the hill, voices echoing into twilight, and always, always, Jonah would be waiting on the steps, clutching a painted pebble, or a string of twigs, or a lopsided drawing of a bird with two heads, one afternoon. As Rachel wiped the chalk from her skirt, a woman approached the fence. She wore a bonnet, dusty at the edges, her hands calloused and nervous. Rachel recognized her Sarah Lynn. She had been one of the first to whisper judgment when Rachel nursed Jonah on her porch. "I came to say something," Sarah began, not stepping through the gate. Rachel waited. "My boy Thomas, he says you're the reason he isn't scared of dark anymore. Says you told them stars are just windows into heaven, and that maybe folks we've lost still peek through now and again." Rachel swallowed. "I did say that." Sarah nodded, her voice cracking. "He thinks you're an angel. I'm not so sure about angels, but I know brave when I see it." She turned to leave, then paused. "I'm sorry, Rachel, for what I said, what I didn't say." Rachel smiled softly. "We're all still learning." That night, Elan brought in a cradle he had built entirely from cedar. It smelled of resin and smoke. Along its side, he had carved symbols for wind, fire, protection, and new beginnings. He set it gently beside their bed and ran a hand over the wood. Rachel stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. He looked at her. "We're growing something here." She nodded. "Yes, and not just wood and walls." Outside, the stars blinked awake, and inside, Jonah crawled beneath the table, chasing the shadow of a moth. There was no ceremony, no proclamation. Only the sound of laughter in the dusk and the warmth of bodies moving through space, once considered empty. Later, as Rachel tucked Jonah into bed, he pointed to the beams above and asked, "What's that say?" She lifted him to read the names carved deep into the wood. "Rachel, Elan, Jonah," she whispered. "That's us." Jonah rested his head against her shoulder and sighed. Rachel closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of pine, smoke, and the future. They were not fugitives anymore, not outcasts. They were builders, teachers, parents, and every morning, when Rachel opened the door to let the sun in, she felt not fear, but gratitude that from ruin, something steady had risen, something worth staying for. The stars were just beginning to prick through the indigo sky when Elan Redhawk lit the lanterns strung between the cedar posts behind the cabin. The paper glowed gold, trembling slightly in the wind, casting soft halos onto the packed earth below. Nearby, a basket brimmed with wildflowers, bluebells, sage, and late-blooming Indian paintbrushes gathered from the ridge. Their scent drifted gently through the clearing, blending with cedar smoke and something sweeter peace. Rachel Callahan stood just beyond the doorway, her dress simple, the sleeves rolled, her hands stained from the dye she'd used to embroider her sash. The bodice was trimmed with beadwork gifted by the Apache women Elan had brought from the northern hills weeks ago, stitched in pale blue and white echoes of sky and snow. Her hair, loose for the first time in years, tumbled freely down her back, braided with sprigs of sage and tiny feathers. She looked not like someone being wed, but like someone returning home after a long journey. Jonah danced barefoot between lanterns, chasing ribbons in the wind, his laugh piercing the quiet like birdsong. There was no preacher that evening, no scripture read aloud. Only Reverend Luther, standing silently to one side as a witness, and Miriam Quinn, who smiled without speaking as she lit the first candle at the fire circle. Ellen knelt down on one knee, not in ceremony, but in offering. In his open palm lay a silver ring, simple, engraved with Apache words that shimmered faintly in the firelight. "You speak with your heart," he said softly. "Will you live with me, not as mine, but as my equal?" Rachel didn't answer with words. She knelt beside him, placed her hand over his, and pulled him gently to his feet. "I am already home," she whispered. That was enough. The children gathered near the edges of the firelight, tossed petals as Jonah clapped and spun. Then, together, under the arch of cedar boughs and hand-woven ribbon. Elan and Rachel joined hands. No vows, no fanfare, just stillness. Later, when the lanterns floated upward into the dusk like glowing seeds, Rachel stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked inside, not at the walls or the fire, but at the feeling the space held: laughter. Sleepy feet padding across wood, the smell of roasted corn and pine sap, the imprint of joy where once there had been only echoes. Elan entered behind her, Jonah on his shoulders, his small hands gripping his father's forehead like reins. He giggled, pointing at the beam above the hearth. "You forgot the names," Jonah said. Elan chuckled. "No, Little Hawk. We saved that part." He lifted Jonah down gently and handed Rachel the carving knife. She stepped beneath the heavy beam and touched its grain with reverence. Then, with hands steady and firm, she etched the letters slowly as Elan held the lantern close. Rachellanjanah. She stepped back, breathing deep. There, she said softly. Now the house remembers too. Jonah grinned, tugging her sleeve. It's ours now. Huh? Rachel scooped him into her arms. It's been hours since the moment you found your way to my porch. Elan placed his hand gently on her shoulder. We do not run from fire, he said. We stand in it. Together. Outside. The lanterns still drifted skyward, bobbing and shimmering like stars drawn down for one night to witness this quiet thing being made. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, and the wind rattled softly at the shutters, not with threat this time, but like an old friend passing by. Rachel stood beneath the beam a moment longer, Jonah resting on her hip. Ellen's hand on her back. She looked up at the carved names and smiled, not because life was easy, or safe, or certain, but because it was shared. Shared fully, chosen freely, and that, she knew, was enough to make even the wildest frontier feel like home. Some stories don't roar, they whisper, and in that whisper, we often hear the truth we've spent years trying to remember. This story reminds us that family is not always bound by blood. Sometimes, it's formed in the quiet moments when a woman opens her door to a stranger, when a man lays down his fear for the sake of a child, when love is chosen in spite of loss. We are all, at some point, asked to choose between safety and compassion, between what the world expects and what our heart knows is right. And it's in those moments, however small, that our character is shaped. For those of us who've lived long enough to know that life rarely goes as planned, this story is a gentle reminder. Healing is possible, even after heartbreak. Home can be rebuilt, even on the ashes of grief. And love. Love doesn't ask for permission. It simply arrives and stays. If we let it, may we all have the courage to open our doors, not just to others, but to the parts of ourselves we thought were long gone. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of something lost or something found, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Here at Wild West Echoes, we believe that some stories are meant to be remembered and shared. We'd be honored to have you ride with us again.